Hello and welcome to Pulse, your podcast delving into all things health, innovation, digital and data, proudly brought to you by Pulse IT News. I'm your host, Louise Shaper.
And I'm your co-host, George Margellis.
Hey George, how have you been the last fortnight? What have you been up to?
Look, it's been a busy fortnight. We'll be discussing it later, but the aged care clinical information system standards came out, which has led to a lot of discussion in that sector. Also have attended a couple of startup events, which is always fun here in Sydney. And yourself, Louise, you been busy?
I have a funny story to tell you. So I've got this health issue and it's been concerning me, nothing too serious, I hope. But anyway, just thinking I need to do something about this. And I get an email from a clinic that I've never been to as a patient, except I did get a COVID vaccine a couple of years ago. Anyway, and they sent me an email last week and they said, Louise, you're in the right age bracket. It's completely free. Medicare will pay for it. If you want to come in, allow up to an hour and we're going to do all this preventative health stuff. So I'm like, perfect, great. Anyway, went in, spent most of my time with the practice nurse, and it was a really good experience, actually, really thorough. And then at the end of the visit, it was meeting with the GP to go over the notes the nurse had taken and talk through any concerns that might have been raised in the appointment. Anyway, the GP said, we're going to send you for some blood tests. And I said, no, don't do that. I've had blood tests taken 3 weeks ago. They're in my health record. You can go get them. And he's looking a bit confused, clicking around his screen. And he's like, I can't see it. And I hadn't seen this particular system, so I won't mention the name, but I hadn't seen this one before. So I wasn't familiar with where things lie, but I'm like, oh yeah, there it is. There's my blood results. Anyway, and for some reason, he could only see the cover page. He couldn't work out how to get the page that actually has the results, which is usually 2 or 3 pages in. And so I was like, maybe click here, click there. We're trying to problem solve together. And then he goes, I see you got it done at Dorovich. And he picks up a pen, picks up a piece of paper. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm just going to call them and get them to fax it through. So I'm like, no. I was like, please do not do that. I said, look, digital health is what I do for a living. I got my street cred to maintain. You cannot fax my records through. I said, look, they're right here on my phone. And because I made it very, very simple, he looked at them on my phone. But yeah, couldn't work out how to get them in the system.
It's disappointing, isn't it, that even though it's technically possible, accessing it isn't straightforward and easy. And I think that's still part of the challenge we face in making it easier to use. I mean, it's a simple problem.
Yeah. And I'm actually going to contact the software provider and talk to their help desk and see if they'll talk me through so that next time when I go there, I can show them what to do. Anyway, but that was my funny story.
Well, yeah, a bit of a reality check, I guess. So it's good to know.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get to our hot topics, George. We're going to kick off with AI. Now, there are lots of use cases for AI in healthcare, but of course, there's a lot of hype too. So on the pod, we like to bring you guys stories of actual, real, tangible outcomes. So I'm pleased to share that we are living in an age where the world's first fully AI-generated drug development is happening. In Abu Dhabi, a company called In Silico Medicine has developed a drug treatment for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which is a deadly lung disease. The drug is currently in late-stage clinical trials, and it was completely designed by AI, from the initial identification of treatment targets to the creation of the drug's molecular structure. So this announcement indicates a really significant breakthrough in AI being used to develop new drugs quickly and in a much more cost-effective way than traditional approaches. But it's not just faster and cheaper. AI isn't just aiding drug development here, it is driving the discovery of new treatments. The uses of AI will no doubt continue to impact on the entire pharmaceutical pipeline, from discovering and designing new medicines to clinical trials, which are really costly and time-consuming, to eventually being part of clinical decision support systems on how drugs are chosen by clinicians. George, what are your thoughts? This is a significant development. Do you think it's going to take long before this approach becomes mainstream within the pharmaceutical research sector?
Actually, I think this is really a very significant and very, very exciting development, because as we're utilizing AI, we've been always looking for that use case. But when we talk about molecules and cellular receptors and protein folding, it really is a hugely complex area which takes up a lot of resources and has a lot of real clinical significance. So the ability to use AI to, for example, as they've done with DeepMind, develop a catalog of protein folding, which is something which For example, insulin, to develop the physical model for insulin took something like 8 years of research and millions of dollars using X-ray crystallography. And yet things like DeepMind's protein folding database has effectively provided a framework for every single protein known to mankind. So utilizing this sort of technology in a very focused way, understanding the physiology of what we're treating in disease, these sort of things are really exciting initiatives, and it'd be great for Australia to play a much more active role here as well, because this is the area I think it's going to make the biggest clinical significantly difference in healthcare.
Oh, amazing. I agree. And agree with the call out for other places in the world. There's not a lot of companies or countries in the world that have developed those targeted drug therapies. This company, they don't have the huge expense because of the AI processes. So apparently they've already got 30 AI designed drugs in the pipeline, and 7 of them are currently in human clinical trials, which is amazing for a really small company.
I did actually get to hear their CEO present at Arab Health earlier this year. So they do a very exciting story about how they're using the technology. And one thing I did see in Arab Health, there was a lot of discussion around the use of AI and also a lot of investment in the area. So that's an interesting play. But yeah, I think it's an opportunity for pharma. One of the challenges we've had in pharma over the last few years has been that there hasn't been a lot of new drugs come to market. And having colleagues in pharma, the cost of introducing a new drug is measured in the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. So it really is some way we can make that more efficient and more effective. Antibiotics are a great example. There really hasn't been a new antibiotic released in the market for decades. And with opportunity to do this more effectively, I think is critical.
I read a book last year by David Feigenbaum, Chasing My Cure. And I won't go into detail, but effectively, he was a medical student from memory and got really sick and ended up with this really rare condition, which has almost killed him numerous times. And this book, Chasing My Cure, was because there was no cure. He's like, well, it's all on me. I'm going to have to work out how to do it myself. And the happy side of his story is the reason he is here is he did find a drug that could treat his condition. It was designed to treat a completely separate thing. And he found through trial and error, it's a great book, a bit of a mystery and a whodunit in some ways, but it's a great book. I really recommend it. But the book actually goes into how that discovery came about. And I believe he has now set up a non-profit organisation that actually looks at drugs that are already on market, used to treat whatever they were designed to treat, but those drugs are now being tested to treat completely different things. And AI would surely be able to speed up that process really quickly.
Absolutely. So as we better understand the physiology and the pathology of these diseases at a cellular level, and this is sort of something that's really grown in leaps and bounds over the last few decades. So when I went through med school, we didn't understand cellular receptors. We talked about them, but we didn't understand them. Now with these new technologies, we're understanding them at a molecular level, utilizing the AI to find those matches, because we're talking literally thousands of, if not tens of thousands of potential receptors and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of potential molecules. That correlation is something that AI can do really well. So opportunity here. I think if anyone is really interested in that space, there's a opportunity for definite advancement there. And I'll be watching. I do love the name In Silico Medicine. What a cool name, eh?
That's right. I'm going to have to be looking when they publicly list, I think.
Definitely.
Not that you should use this podcast for financial advice, people. Okay. Next story, George. In news out this week, something you are very familiar with, the Australian Digital Health Agency and the Department of Health and Aged Care have released the first aged care clinical information system standards, a set of recommended minimum software requirements for software in aged care that stores clinical information. George, I note that you were quoted in the government media release, rightly so. So what can you tell us about this development and why is it a big deal?
Look, it is an exciting step forward for the aged care industry. Like you said, the Royal Commission's now been out almost 3 years. A number of its recommendations specifically talked around the use of clinical information systems and how we use standards and enable better communications. And it's taken a while to get to these standards, and some people have sort of been complaining about that in the media. But the reality is that when you look at the Royal Commission, there was 148 recommendations. So the whole aged care industry really is under the thumb at the moment, trying to respond to all those potential reforms. One thing we need to keep in mind here for the more technical people in the audience, these standards aren't sort of the standards that we're used to when we start talking about messaging standards and HL7 standards. They are a very high level set of standards, more guidelines about how people need to think about how they implement clinical information systems and what sort of things they should be talking to their software providers about. So don't expect to walk into here and see a whole bunch of detailed HL7 messaging type requirements and very deep technical standard requirements, but it is a first step. And it's a really important first step. The Agent Community Care Providers Association and the Medical Software Industry Association have supported this first step, digging deeper into the technical side of things. Is going to require us to develop the digital literacy of the sector. But I think the important thing is that we've started on the journey. The Australian Digital Health Agency has invested in an aged care specific working group to focus on these things. But the key here, of course, is for the aged care providers to be part of that journey, be part of those discussions. And I think that's where we're still having some challenges, not because of a lack of goodwill, but just a lack of resources. I mean, the aged care providers are really under the thumb at the moment, just meeting day-to-day demands.
Yeah, it must be so hard for them to even allocate the right personnel with the right qualifications, the right know-how, the right access to even have time to go to the meetings. Yeah, it must be really challenging.
When we talk about the workforce challenges in aged care, we've seen the huge challenges with RNs and we've seen the huge challenge with just care providers. We did a study last year, a year or so or two ago, with the Aged Care Council looking specifically at IT workforce. And there's something like a 50 to 60% turnover because once they've developed some basic IT skills, the demand in the general workforce is so great that people jump ship. Whilst many people join aged care to provide a social good, the reality is the young IT professionals can get significantly more money in other roles, so they do jump ship. So we need to develop that internal IT sector more effectively.
Well, no doubt we'll be visiting this topic again and again. And I do know, I won't spoil it, but we've got someone pretty important on the pod coming up in a future episode to go into this in more detail. So we'll discuss it then, George, as well.
Fantastic. Well, I will put a pitch in that we are running the ITAC conference again next year in March. So this is where we sit down with 500 or so of your best friends and have that discussion. I know Kate was there this year and I think it was a good event and lots of fun as well. So I invite people to keep it on their calendars.
Absolutely. Okay, what's the diary hold we have to put on, George, if you got a date?
11th to 13th of March, 2025. That's pretty well locked in.
And do you have a venue?
It'll be Melbourne.
Melbourne. In March, that'll be all right.
I wanted to make it easy for you, Louise. I want to make sure you're there this time, not sunning yourself in New Caledonia like you managed to get away this year.
I know. Oops, I'll never get away with that again. Okay, I will be there. Next, we're going to talk about sex and relationships. Now, don't worry, Pulse Potties, if you have young children in the room, this conversation is not going to get too risque. The emerging field of sextech, which is using digital data, robotics, and AI to modify and potentially enhance our intimate relationships and sexual lives. Our relationship with technology has really always been intimate. Our phones are pretty much extensions of our bodies and minds, but sex tech and specifically AI is taking that philosophy into an entirely new realm. AI companion apps are being developed, and 8 of them have made VC firm Andreessen Horowitz's top 100 Gen AI consumer apps. These apps, which are effectively AI girlfriends and AI boyfriends, offer companionship that is customized to one's preferences, and the data shows really high engagement scores, more so than any other category of app, including even the messaging apps that you use with other humans. In addition to companion apps, there are apps which I've mentioned before on the pod that generate deepfake, pornographic, sexually explicit images and videos of real-life people. We're increasingly seeing stories of deep trauma being caused to victims, many of which are schoolgirls. But I am pleased to say that the Australian government just this week has passed legislation making the sharing of explicit AI-generated images a crime. Yay, Australia, the rest of the world, please do the same. But on the positive side, there are AI-powered therapy bots. bots that use AI to provide emotional support and help users navigate relationships, including sexual concerns. These tools usually are non-judgmental and are seen as a safe space for people to explore their feelings, work through issues, and receive guidance on sexual and emotional well-being. George, it's probably too early to tell, but do you think we're heading into a world where the intimate use of AI will deeply impact our relationships and our health?
Well, I must admit, this is a very interesting topic, and I will start with a disclaimer. I have been married for 35 years, so my dating background is probably a long time away. But I did hear recently on an economist podcast that the use of dating apps is starting to decrease, and people are becoming much more wary about how they're using those sort of things. So this is really an interesting area. To a large degree, this comes down to mental health support and community support. In aged care, we talk about loneliness, but post-COVID, what's happened in the world over the last few years, that loneliness epidemic may be much broader than just in aged care. So I think this really reflects out what's happening in our society. And it may well be a positive use. I mean, we've seen, and we discussed in one of the recent podcasts, how mental health apps have a place to play in helping, supporting people around the world. And this may well be part of that. Hopefully we can, as a society, fill in the gaps. But AI may play a very important role going forward to enable us to provide at least a constant level of care to more members of our society.
I just find this whole area incredibly fascinating. The morning that ChatGPT announced that you could talk to it and it would talk back to you, and it was using the not Scarlett, but it sort of sounds like Scarlett Johansson. It sounds like her voice. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But anyway, so I woke up in the morning and I thought, oh, I'm going to try this. And I was lying in bed. I was on my own in a hotel room overseas. And I was like, hello, ChatGPT, how are you feeling today? Now, I have never typed a personal statement like that. I wouldn't think of typing that, but I was conversational. And I ended up chatting to this thing for longer than I should have. Probably 5 minutes, had a conversation with this chat bot. And I was like, okay, well, I've got to go now, go to shower and start my day. And then, finish the conversation. I'm like, this is weird. It felt really natural to do that.
Did you apologize to ChatGPT when you had to leave the conversation? And say, well, I'll get back to you. So,
I did. Even when I type, I'm very polite to the AI algorithms because, when they do rise up and take over, I want them to remember that I was always very polite and nice and I had good manners.
It is another one of those great examples where Hollywood preceded us, isn't it? And when you look at, there's been a couple of movies out about people becoming with their AI counterparts and all sorts of weird and wonderful things happening. So that's part of it, I guess. Science fiction is the way to go.
Yes, my partner likes to say we're like living in the future now. The negative stuff that I'm concerned with is, especially if you're young and feeling socially isolated and then you start engaging with a bot effectively, then does that mean we're potentially going to lose the ability, skills, and even the desire to have meaningful human relationships? Because human relationships are messy, hard, but they ultimately define our humanity. And, social isolation versus these unrealistic expectations on relationships. I'm curious to see where this goes. Certainly, if I had children, I'd be discussing these topics with them.
It is an issue. Whilst these tools can provide us with many benefits, they have to also think of the consequences. They have a role to play in helping people who struggle with those issues to build up their skills. But at the end of the day, they really need to try them out in the real world. So I think we need to focus on that.
Absolutely. Our next hot topic is one we will revisit often on Pulse, the link between preventative health, longevity, health span, and healthcare business models. A study's just come out in BMJ Open on life expectancy in high-income English-speaking countries. So for our listeners in Asia Pacific and parts of Europe, this does not apply to you, but I think you'd still find it interesting. But yes, because I know some of you guys have way better life expectancy than us. But in terms of these English-speaking countries, from 1999 to 2019, this study shows that Australia, we're the place to be, with the US, not surprised, trailing behind. The good news for our Irish listeners is you guys saw the largest gains in life expectancy, with 6.5 to 8 years gained in that 20-year period. But my American mother-in-law, statistically speaking, is going to die 4 years younger than my Australian mum, with the US clearly at the bottom of the life expectancy leaderboard. So, why is this relevant to our digital health podcast? At 10.5% of GDP, Australia spends less on healthcare than Britain, America, or Canada, but we have the lower rates of avoidable deaths. With chronic diseases rising, digital innovations and changes in healthcare business models can enable preventative health and extend health span. Our health systems are largely built on data frameworks. They're not reactive. They don't serve to prevent illness and disease. But there is a growing movement towards health span and longevity fueled by bioscience, biotech, and digital innovation. Integrating preventative healthcare into existing systems will require changes, though, in what we fund and how we fund it. The Tony Blair Institute in the UK recently proposed modifying healthcare business models to invest in population health as a valued national asset, using data to drive prevention and target geographic areas of need. George, these concepts aren't new, and in some sense they are sort of common sense, but there is a reason that funding models of healthcare haven't changed much in all these years. Do you think that we're going to see payers, whether it's government and or private, substantially change what they pay for in an effort to keep us healthier for longer?
This has been a topic of discussion for decades, and I will quote the late, great Gough Whitlam, who made a statement many, many years ago that in a two-horse race between self-interest and public good, you always should place your money on self-interest. The public good of preventative health has been espoused for generations. I mean, it goes back as far as Hippocrates. Even some of those early writings talk about preventative health measures. However, at the end of the day, people think about what's relevant to them at that point in their life. And the systems have reflected that with our current fee-for-service models. The reality is we do invest some money in public health now. We may not be doing enough. Is it the doctor's role to discuss preventative health, or is this something that should be taught in primary school? It's a really complex discussion. We've been discussing preventative health for a while, and we have seen a new focus on it fairly recently with the publication of a number of books by some well-known authors and podcasts, and unfortunately a bit of a rise of some snake oil salesmen in the industry that are promoting longevity drugs and supplements probably well and beyond what the evidence suggests. And whilst Australia's done a great job in having one of the longest lifespans in the world, we still do struggle with health span. And I'm pretty sure we'll have many more detailed discussions on our podcast around the difference between lifespan and health span and what we can do from a digital perspective to improve those things.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I'm really looking forward to it. Tomorrow night, I'm on a webinar with the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. I'm on a panel discussing wearables, and I'm fascinated to find out how many GPs show up. What sort of level of interest is there? We'll have a good conversation on wearables and sensors and apps, because when you look at that type of technology, that ambient monitoring technology that's continuous, if you want it to be, combine that with our genomic profile and with AI, like the future with precision healthcare and what we'll be able to do around disease predictability and diagnosis. You know, that's where I think the secret sauce, it has to be buried in there somewhere to get governments and healthcare payers to actually change what they fund and how they fund it, because there's going to be a growing evidence base that will be undeniable that, you know, humans, we can actually prevent a lot of these things. We don't have to die of a lot of these conditions that we die of.
Interesting. I mean, the strengthening Medicare stuff that came out a couple of years ago and the My Medicare models, again, more focused on those at the pointy end of the healthcare situation. But the reality is prevention can't start at 70, although there is evidence that even if you do start it late, it does have positive benefits. So just because you're on in years doesn't mean you shouldn't think about these preventative health things, but implementing them at an earlier stage and making it possible. You know, we talk about how do you make cities safe for exercise so people can exercise. And there's many issues. But at the end of the day, sometimes a chocolate cake and a couple of drinks a night are very tempting. So I have to admit that I'm less than perfect in that regards.
Aren't we all? Well, I particularly loved how Science Daily reported the story. And they said, and I'm quoting, "Despite being home to some of the world's most dangerous animals, Australia has led the English-speaking world in life expectancy for the last 3 decades." And so, Pulse Potties, here's my public service announcement for our non-Aussie listeners. The spiders and snakes, and actually the sharks, they're relatively easy to avoid. It's really the drop bears you have to watch out for.
Yeah, you watch out for those Australian trees. They're dangerous.
Okay, after this brief break, we'll be back with our special guest of Pulse, Dr. Chris Longhurst, for a conversation about implementing AI in the real world, specifically in hospital settings. Chris has some great stories to tell and some bold predictions too. Today's guest is someone who spent their professional career not just at the intersection of innovation and healthcare, but in leading us into new realms. Dr. Chris Longhurst is the Chief Clinical and Innovation Officer at UC San Diego Health. He is a leader in transforming the way AI is integrated into medicine and, most importantly, how do we make healthcare smarter and more compassionate? One of the things that makes Chris unique is his dedication to research and writing as a key way to share new ideas, new discoveries, and new learnings. He has authored over 150 publications. So, he's got the academic street cred. But if only other academics read those publications, then we know what it's like. It'll just take too long to directly impact how medicine is practiced today. So, Chris is dedicated to write what he does and does what he writes, ensuring that these innovations translate into real, meaningful outcomes for patients. I like to think of Chris as a bit of a triple threat. He's super smart, a dedicated and thus prolific researcher, but he's also a great communicator. I'm thrilled to dive into this conversation about the future of AI in medicine and what it means for both clinicians and patients. Welcome to the PulsePod studio, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me, Louise.
Great to have you on board, Chris.
Now, Chris, look, this is a very serious podcast, and most importantly, because PulsePod listeners will demand to know, I need to ask you for an update on Nolan. For those of you who weren't there and you're thinking, who's Nolan? Well, Nolan Longhurst was the youngest delegate at the HIT conference George and I were at a few weeks ago, and he was quite a hit. So, Chris, how's Nolan going?
Nolan is doing great. He just started 7th grade today, and I asked him his favorite memories of summer, and it was our trip to Australia. So we had an absolutely great time. I'm very grateful to the staff at HIC who provided a name badge and all the vendors that gave him lots of swag that he brought home.
Brilliant. Love it.
It was great fun having him there. He was really a joy to have a young one bumping around, and he was really engaged, which is great. So, Chris, going through med school, did you ever think you would become deeply ingrained in digital medicine? What are the motivations that got your career shifted in that direction?
Well, thanks for the question, George. And no, I did not think that, at least early in medical school. But the background is that I got enamored by computers and information technology. In high school, I actually minored in computer science during my college years. And when I went to medical school, I was looking for a way to integrate that interest. And I ran across these faculty in what was called health informatics. And so I got very lucky to be at a place where there were leaders like Dr. Mike Hogarth, who were just establishing a master's graduate program in health informatics. And that gave me the opportunity to take time off from medical school to explore this intersection between how we can use information technology to deliver higher quality care.
Chris, can I ask you about that? Because we see it all the time where people who are trained in medicine decide to have an interest in health informatics and digital health. And it seems a really scary idea for them. It feels like they're stepping away from medicine. And that is so not the case. Did you experience that?
Well, I'll say when I took time off from medical school to study this, most of my colleagues in medical school were like, Chris, what in the hell are you doing? And it was hard to answer at the time because there was no clear career path. And I was taking a bit of a risk, exploring this opportunity. But I give a lot of credit to my father, who was one of my role models and real mentors. My dad was academic internist, cardiologist, MD, PhD, basic scientist. And the advice that he gave me is, Chris, there's a lot of physicians, but there's very few that are cross-trained in different kind of specialties. And so it was really his encouragement to pursue the formal training that led me to do the master's degree. And it's really held me in good stead my entire career because it gave me time away from the clinical rotations to really look at the literature around what had been done. It's where I developed my love of the scholarship and the literature and a passion for contributing to it as we learn more and more about how we can use these tools to help deliver higher quality care.
That is really quite exciting because I reflect my experience, unfortunately, wasn't quite as rosy because trying to do clinical informatics when I was going through med school was do this in your own time, on your own dime, and there's no career prospects available for it. So it's good to see the progress. But the key thing there, of course, is that mentor who sort of gives you that support along the process.
Absolutely. And I would say that's going to be a theme of this podcast, as I've just been so fortunate to be surrounded by amazing people who've given me opportunities. When I finished my residency training in pediatrics at the Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford University, they were just embarking on electronic health record implementation. And so I was already known as the pediatrician with some informatics training, and I just happened to be the right guy in the right place at the right time. And so, luck favors the prepared, but I can only credit those mentors who guided me to be prepared. And these opportunities have helped to shape my career.
Oh, that's so good to hear. So I have an AI question for you, Chris. In the keynote that you gave at INHIC at Brisbane, you stated that AI could be the biggest healthcare advance since antibiotics. Tell me why.
So that's a bold statement, right? At the same time, though, the context to that statement was that if you ask a room full of people, including the 1,000 at HIC, right? And you say, raise your hand if you or a loved one has experienced a misdiagnosis or a delayed diagnosis that caused harm. Generally, half the room at least will raise their hands. And that's because of the simple truth that we're all human, right? And in fact, dirty little secret, 50% of doctors are below average. So reality is we're not all making the same diagnoses at the same time. There's going to be variability. And we try to bring tools and guidelines and checklists and other things to standardize and improve the care that we deliver uniformly, but it doesn't always work. And even Larry Weed, in his original 1968 article about the problem-oriented medical record, described that if we wanted to improve our ability to make timely diagnoses, computerizing the medical record would be the solution. We've spent the last 10 or 15 years doing that across the United States, Australia, and lots of other countries. But to date, while we've digitized that infrastructure and we've made some improvements in efficiency and other things, we really haven't delivered the full promise. And so the reason I'm so bullish about AI is because I think that with the digital infrastructure that we've invested in, AI gives us the tool now to transform all of that data, the text data, the image data, the vision data, everything into something that's really going to make us all above average when it comes to making timely diagnoses and finding the best possible treatments in a personalized, precise way.
So, Chris, that sounds like an exciting future, but then with generative AI, we have seen those challenges where it doesn't necessarily give you the same answer every time. You get the hallucinations. Sometimes the answer you get is only as good as the data you put in. And we do know that in many parts of the healthcare sector, data capture is not a great exercise in itself. The evidence base for it making a difference, sensitivity, specificity, we hear all those areas under the curve. If it gives you half a dozen differential diagnoses, does that make it better or worse for the clinicians making decisions?
Great questions, George. So I mentioned the health AI paradox, which is that the research algorithms are rarely implemented, and the implemented algorithms are rarely researched, and we're working to close that. And I think that's the answer to what you just asked, which is there's lots of different tools, and generative AI is the latest, and it's sexy because it can interpret text data and other things without a bunch of training. But it's probabilistic because it doesn't give the same answers every time, right? And it's very highly dependent on prompts and other things. And so we have to better understand how all of these work. So let me give you a real example from UC San Diego Health of how we were using traditional machine learning and then what happened when we added in generative AI. I've shared this description before about our work in sepsis, and this was led by Doctors Gabe Wardy and Shamim Namadi here at UCSD. And they were tackling the problem of we deliver the best possible care we can to patients with sepsis, but we don't always identify it early enough to rescue and treat appropriately. And so we know there's opportunities to identify it earlier in the process. So Shamim built a fantastic machine learning algorithm that helps identify possibility of sepsis much earlier than some of the other algorithms available from vendors. But if you don't integrate that into workflow, it doesn't make a difference. My mentor, Dr. Tool Butte, is fond of saying that all the data in the world won't make a difference without people to act on it. And so he partnered with Gabe Wardy, who chairs our sepsis committee, and they figured out how to really effectively integrate this into workflow. And guess what? We studied this for 18 months, and it was associated with a 20% reduction in mortality of sepsis patients in our emergency department, which is amazing. The first deep learning algorithm ever associated with a mortality improvement. Okay, what about large language models? That was all discrete data. And it turns out most of the data in our clinical records are actually text data. So we layered in large language models to see if the text data would make our algorithms more accurate or more helpful. And the answer, at least in the emergency department, was it didn't. Why? Because the patients coming in the emergency department, those emergency room physicians, usually don't write their notes until the patient's being dispoed and going out the door. And so the substrate wasn't really there. In contrast, we're trying to improve our management of postoperative sepsis. And it's a really challenging problem because postoperative sepsis looks a lot like postoperative physiology, just normal inflammation. And so it's a challenge for us. It's a challenge for places across the world. But when we layered large language models in for postoperative sepsis, we found it significantly improved our algorithm. Why? Because the proceduralists and surgeons are writing their operative notes right at the end of the procedure. And the intensivists in the ICU are writing their accept notes right as the patient arrives. And so it turns out that data is really valuable for helping identify those patients who would be at highest risk for postoperative sepsis. So a lot of this comes down to workflow and just really testing and understanding how is it actually going to work as implemented.
It's fascinating to me, and you're the first person that I've heard call it out, Chris, that paradox where there's all of this academic literature being written about algorithms as applied to medicine, and we're not looking at patient outcomes. It just strikes me as an insane thing that that's where we're at right now. Do you think that's going to change?
I certainly hope so. And, like a lot of new tools, there's, I think, too many people focused on the shiny object. AI could do this and AI could solve everything. And of course, that's not true. And 10 years after the introduction of, cryptocurrencies, we're not seeing blockchain solving medical record problems, right?
We can still live in hope, Chris.
Yeah, right. I've given up that hope, Louise. But to me, it's all about the focus on the problems that need to be solved. And in fact, I'm not the AI guy. I serve as our system chief medical officer. I'm responsible for the quality and safety of the care that we deliver. I know enough about AI to be dangerous, but I hired Dr. Karandeep Singh, who's our chief health AI officer, the inaugural at our health system. And Karandeep can go deep on this, and he knows the ins and outs of the different tools, and he's incredibly bright and articulate. And Karandeep and I recently wrote an article in the New England Journal AI talking about exactly what you just said, which is we think the focus needs to be on implementation science with a laser focus on measuring outcomes that matter. And those are outcomes that matter to patients and to the caregivers delivering that care. Ultimately, we want to improve the experience of both receiving and delivering care.
Absolutely. And the field of patient safety, this is all related to. Do you really see that that is going to be one of the key business drivers as well as a quality driver for AI in medicine?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked, Louise, because another one of my mentors in my career has been Dr. Paul Sherrick, who is the Chief Quality Officer at Stanford Children's. Just as I was hired on to an electronic health record project at Stanford in 2004, 20 years ago. And Dr. Sherrick had sold the board of directors at Stanford that after the Institute of Medicine reported the epidemic of medical errors, and in 2001 on Crossing the Quality Chasm identified that computerized prescriber order entry could be part of the solution to reducing medication harm, the board decided to invest in this big CPOE project. And so I joined that really with an eye towards how can we use these tools to improve quality and safety of care, particularly in the children that we served at the Children's Hospital. And we made some dents in that. In fact, we published an association between our CPOE implementation and an improvement in mortality at Stanford Children's way back in 2010. But across the country, what we've seen is that too few of these electronic health record implementations were associated with an improvement in patient safety. And in fact, here we are 25 years after the publication of the seminal book, To Err is Human. And the reality is that we're still seeing medication errors and medical errors occurring at a rate similar to 25 years ago. So we kind of have to take a step back and acknowledge we just have not made the progress that we wanted to or should have. And yet, here's this new tool. And so I'm really bullish on the opportunity for this tool to do things like reduce diagnostic errors and improve the safety of diagnosis, but also to improve things like our ability to reduce pressure ulcers or improve surgical site infection rates. I think there's so many untapped opportunities to use AI tools to provide that safety net of 24/7 tireless monitoring of both patients in the hospital, remotely monitored patients in their home setting, and elsewhere.
So, Chris, I'm old enough to remember the advent of evidence-based medicine. So I was really quite excited to hear you speak passionately earlier about the need for evidence in this space. Taking the basics of evidence-based medicine, so the old David Sackett, Cochrane type stuff, do we need to change that methodology for things like AI? Because the technology is moving so quickly, we don't have time for a 3-year randomized control study. How do we change the paradigm of evidence generation with using in the AI world?
George, a fantastic question. And this is an area of passion. First of all, the answer is no. We should not change that paradigm. Evidence based medicine is the right way to practice, and it takes some time to develop that evidence. What we need to do is double down on generating the evidence. And so while I'm bullish on AI, and I really do think it's going to be the biggest application in medicine since antibiotics, it's not going to be tomorrow. I think we are over promising what could happen in the next, let's say, 1 to 3 years. But I think we're underappreciating what could actually happen in the next 7 to 10 years. I think over the next 7 to 10 years, as we generate all the evidence, we're going to completely redesign the way healthcare is delivered. But it's not going to happen overnight because we have to generate that evidence. So then the question becomes, how do you best generate that evidence? And I have a lot of passionate feelings about that. Number one, we should be studying everything we do. And that's really the premise of a learning health system. So I'm a big believer in that. The digital infrastructure creates the opportunity to have a learning health system. And in fact, one of the things we've done here at UC San Diego Health to help catalyze that is to bring together our institutional review board that look at ethics of research with our quality folks so that we can really examine that gray zone. I wrote a paper a few years ago called Evidence-Based Medicine, the Electronic Health Record Era. And it's really about this opportunity in a learning health system to generate data so quickly that you can treat patients using that data that you've generated on similar patients, as opposed to just waiting for peer-reviewed evidence that's highly applicable to that particular patient.
I guess the best example we had was the Vioxx story, where they used the data from their EMR at Kaiser to pick up on trends early.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we know there are digital health interventions like apps on the phone and closed loop monitoring for patients with diabetes that can have as big or bigger of an effect on hemoglobin A1C or blood pressure in hypertensive patients than a new medication. And yet we've got to study these interventions just the same way we would study new drugs, et cetera. So generating the evidence is critical, and continuing to live by sort of this idea of evidence-based medicine and only using high-value treatments critical. But we have to generate the evidence around digital therapeutics and AI in healthcare so that we understand how best to apply it.
Absolutely. And not just generate the evidence, but get it out there. So, Chris, what advice would you give clinicians and health executives? What should we be doing now or yesterday to prepare ourselves and our workforces for these substantial AI-related changes?
That's a loaded question. So first of all, Australia is similar to the United States in one way, which is all of our hospitals and clinical practices, they operate on these thin grocery store margins. The total GDP spend may be very different in the United States, but at the end of the day, it's not like these health systems are flush with cash to just go invest in new technologies. And it's another important reason to develop the evidence around what really works so that you're making investments that are high value. Things that I think clinicians and executives can do to prepare for this is, number one, get educated. You start learning more. There's all sorts of forums for this because just as many people are now using ChatGPT in their everyday life to search the web or help respond to emails, it's going to become an ubiquitous part of medicine. It's not just going to be in the clinical setting or the revenue cycle setting. It's going to be throughout the healthcare delivery process. So I think it's really incumbent on all of us to learn more about what that means. That doesn't mean we all have to become experts, though. And I think having resident experts are really critical, not just for understanding what to do, but for understanding what not to do. Where is AI not applicable? And Dr. Karndeep Singh, I mentioned, is our inaugural Chief Health AI Officer. And he's been really great about that. He's helping to chair our AI governance committee. Probably the most important thing he's doing is questioning when we should not be using AI because it doesn't align with our ethical principles or could introduce inequities or exacerbate existing gaps in health disparities. Things like that become really important. And so having processes like an AI governance chaired by somebody who's thinking and breathing this every day, I think is important. I do think that the chief AI officer is going to be something not only in health systems, but really across industries that's going to become a critical role moving forward.
A couple of years ago, Louise played a major role in starting off what we call the CXIO network over here. So looking very much at new roles for clinicians. Unfortunately, due to funding, it didn't quite get where we would like to be. But the idea that clinicians can take secondary roles that also involve other parts of the organization, critical. And to your point, I mean, education is the key there. So when we talk about AI education, there's a plethora of books and publications out there. Recommendations. What do you recommend a up and coming young doctor picks up and has a look at around clinical utility AI?
First of all, George, I'm going to play to my audience here and say the PulsePod is the first source of place you should go, all right? Obviously. But I find there's a lot of other really helpful sources too. In particular, I'm a huge fan of New England Journal AI. So this was founded recently by Dr. Zach Kahani, who's the editor-in-chief. Zach is an outstanding pediatric endocrinologist, and he mentored my mentor, Dr. Atul Butte. And I think that both the focus of the journal, New England Journal AI, has been great, but there's also an associated podcast that some of the associate editors lead, and I've learned a lot listening to that. So I think that's another great source as well. There's obviously a lot of scholarship coming out in different journals like JAMA and others around AI. Some of it's of varying quality. So just as you would with any evidence-based medicine, you have to take a skeptical eye. And then I'm going to plug a book that I thought was really useful. The book is called The AI Revolution in Medicine, GPT-4 and Beyond. And this book was published by Peter Lee, who is at Microsoft. And he did that in collaboration with Zach Kahani and Carrie Goldberg. And I think the important thing here is Peter and Zach are friends of mine. They're kind of dry. And I think they would acknowledge that. They're scientists. But Carrie Goldberg was an NPR correspondent who has made this book eminently readable, and it's wonderful for a flight. And this is a really thought-provoking book that was written in the early days of GPT-4 about what kind of possibilities that creates.
Thanks, Dad. Actually, you mentioned I actually downloaded that book a couple of weeks ago and started reading it. And again, the opening scenarios that it has starts off with are really great insight into possibilities.
Credit to Carrie Goldberg. And actually, the foreword was written by Sam Altman, too.
Cool.
Cool. Well, I'll be downloading that one and catching up with you guys. All right, Chris, predictions. Fast forward, say 2, 5, 10 years. How would the practice of medicine have changed thanks to these AI tools?
As Yogi Berra said, the hardest thing to predict is the future. So I'll do my best. 2 years, I think we're going to see AI scribes are pretty ubiquitous. I think in the United States, it's going to be sort of a barrier of entry. I think every health system is going to have these almost ubiquitously. But in terms of other AI tools, I think we'll see things rolling out on different health systems in different ways. But I don't think we'll see a lot of uber prevalent tools in just 2 years. In 5 years, though, I expect that most electronic health records are going to have AI deeply integrated into almost every workflow. So just like in your productivity suite today, you're getting AI-based suggestions and help on how to write emails or put together spreadsheets or slide decks, et cetera. I think that we're going to see that level of integration in electronic health records where it's really guiding, suggesting, making things easier, et cetera. I think it continues to be a decision support tool for clinicians, and our clinicians will continue to be primarily accountable. I do think that in 5 years, we'll see that these AI scribes are not just transcribing in an intelligent way the visit, but actually suggesting differential diagnosis based off the history and exam findings that were described. And here are some rare but potentially dangerous diagnoses to consider, along with some tests that you might consider ordering. So 5 years, I think we're starting to see the promise of AI. In 10 years, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to say, I'm going to predict that in the United States, within 10 years, we're going to see an AI agent that's actually licensed to practice medicine.
Ooh, big call.
I think that that's going to be a really big moment when that happens, but I think it'll happen within 10 years. We've already seen AI agents that can pass board exams, particularly in things like psychiatry, behavioral health, where we have a huge shortage and a massive epidemic. And so I think in 10 years, we might see an AI agent that's actually been licensed to practice medicine. And the question then becomes, well, who would you hold accountable if there were an error or something? And I think that the technology producer, the owner of these agents, would be in that position then of being held accountable financially and ethically. But I think it's very possible that we're going to see AI practicing independent medicine in a decade.
Cool.
Amazing.
One of the other big quotes around predictions is the best way to predict the future is to actually create it. What advice would you give people to go in and start inventing these sort of things we're talking about in the next 10 years? Any helpful advice? I've got 3 boys who I want to all become millionaires so that I can retire better.
That's a good plan. So, I credit another one of my mentors, Dr. Atul Butte, who was really passionate about creating new technologies and new solutions, algorithms, intellectual property in his lab. But he was also passionate about close industry partnerships to license that IP and scale it. And Stanford has a great culture around this. UC San Diego has a great culture around this, which is these industry interactions, I think, are going to be critical for making sure that the technologies and the tools that have been demonstrated through peer-reviewed evidence to be successful can then be commercialized and scaled so it helps all patients all over. That's where I hope to see things evolve, is that these things will get tested in partnership with industry or sometimes created in the university and academic environments, but then really commercialized in a way that makes sense and lowers cost and improves quality of care and delivers the outcomes to all of our family and friends that we want and deserve.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. That's been a really enlightening discussion.
Thanks so much, Chris, for joining us in the PulsePod studio. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, and we look forward to catching up next time.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Now it's time for an update from our correspondent, Kate McDonald from the Pulse IT News Desk. Welcome, Kate. Are you safe? Are you dry? I know Tassie has copped some really bad weather in recent days.
We've got a bit of respite today. It stopped raining after 300 centuries of downpour that we've experienced well, that's what it feels like in the last couple of weeks. But we do have some lunatics who have been caught trying to climb Mount Wellington. Just yesterday, we had a group of 17 people who decided to climb Mount Wellington, which is the highlight of Hobart. Everyone can see it. It's quite tall, and it gets the winds coming in from Antarctica that plunge the temperature down to -30. So it's not a good idea to climb Mount Wellington in winter. But some people decided to do that anyway. So 17 people had to be rescued. And while Park Service was up there rescuing them, they stumbled across 5 other people who had decided to do it as well and were in real trouble. So they all had to be rescued and brought down to somewhere warmer. It's a beautiful town, Hobart, but don't climb Mount Wellington in winter. It's not a good idea.
Good public service announcement. Well done,
Yes.
Kate. Jeez, I'm glad everyone's okay. Oh, okay.
They're all fine.
Well, what news updates do you have for us this week?
It's been a big week in aged care, as George has talked about on this episode. First, there was an announcement about the integration of 2 of our systems, My Aged Care and My Health Record, and that is getting started. For those who aren't familiar with them, My Aged Care is sort of like a portal that holds client records for older people who are accessing government-supported aged care. It doesn't hold a great deal of health information, so the idea always was, when these 2 systems were set up, that there would be an integration so that you can access some of the health information in My Health Record and some of the care information or client support information in My Aged Care. And that's about to happen in October. Healthcare providers will be able to see within My Health Record some of the client support plans that are held in My Aged Care. The main benefit will be for hospital discharge planning. So discharge nurses can see what supports are out there for their clients much more easily. This is just a first step, but eventually there will be some sharing of healthcare information. So it's great to see that sort of integration happening and the interoperability that we constantly talk about in digital health. There was also, as George mentioned earlier, the minimum requirements for software. That's a result of a huge amount of work from the software vendors, the Digital Health Agency. And I've got to say, reading through the documents, George's team at the Aged Care Industry IT Council, George and Anne Livingston, deserve a huge amount of support for the amount of work that went into that. It's just quite remarkable. We did, though, have one query about it, one aspect of the government's plans, and that is its insistence that there'll be no funding available to aged care providers to buy or upgrade their existing software to be more conformant with these standards. They're relying on the software vendors to include these standards in their product roadmaps, but we think the aged care providers might be a bit disappointed with this. We asked our poll on the weekend whether it was likely that aged care providers will take up conformance software if they don't get any financial incentives. And it's running at about 70% of respondents saying no, they won't without a bit of funding. So that's a bit of a problem to face. And just this week, the Australian Digital Health Agency, Louise, you'll be keen on this, released a new offer for allied health software vendors to work on making their clinical systems more modern and conformant with modern standards. And there will be money on offer for the software vendors there. So that's good news for allied health. There will be an allied health document as well that is being worked on that'll sit on the My Health record. In other aged care news, this one's really interesting. The Department of Health and Aged Care has released a tender to do a pilot of virtual nurses in aged care. That sounds very interesting. Australian residential aged care facilities are now required to provide 40 minutes of hands-on care from a registered nurse every day. But providers are finding it a big struggle to find enough nurses to fill those jobs. RNs in aged care certainly are not enough of them out there. So using things like virtual nurses is really one way that particularly residential aged care facilities in rural and remote areas can up the amount of clinical care that they get. There's one aged care provider out there, McLean Care, that set up its own virtual care subsidiary that's providing allied health and registered nurses to rural and remote facilities virtually. And we'll be looking at these sort of models in depth this week in Pulse IT, particularly what primary health networks are doing to support GPs and aged care doing telehealth. PHNs have been provided with grants from the government to upskill aged care facilities in their use of telehealth. But unfortunately, a lot of these grants have simply gone to buying very nice pieces of equipment, particularly telehealth carts, that unfortunately aren't used very much. They're sort of parked in the corner like a wallflower at a disco, which is quite sad. And the main reason is a lot of nurses don't or forget how to use them, but also a lot of it has to do with GPs setting. These sorts of problems, though, won't stop the march of virtual care. We had a lovely story last week about virtual care in Ireland. They're trying to reduce the number of people presenting in emergency departments with conditions that are best dealt with by the GP. We're doing the same thing here. It's a global problem, but we really like this initiative by the Irish Nurses and Midwifery Organisation, and they call it Trolley Watch. So basically, they track the number of patients waiting on trolleys each day, publish that information, and shame the government into trying to do something about it by calling it Trolley Watch. Virtual care can certainly help with this sort of thing. We'll keep an eye on what's happening over there with a great deal of interest. And that's pretty much all that's happening this week, but there'll certainly be a lot next week.
Oh, that's amazing. Kate, I felt like a trip back in time for me because 20 years ago, almost to the day, I was actually employed to evaluate telehealth. And I was a research assistant at the time, so I wasn't the boss of anything. I was doing what I was told. But yeah, I was evaluating WA's telehealth program, which what we found out, which everyone knew, was that, yeah, we've got all these really expensive pieces of equipment sitting in a corner. So I'm glad to see that things have progressed somewhat, but we haven't really mastered that universally, have we?
What's that famous saying? Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I think we're seeing that over and over again in our sector. But like you said, I mean, that example you have there of McLean Care, great example of how they're using the virtual nursing. But the reality was the virtual nursing services weren't recognised as part of those care minutes, so therefore became a real challenge. So understanding the various codependencies are critical. And big shout out to Pulse IT for its great support of the aged care sector. Thank you, Kate and team and Emma and the team. Emily, it's been a really game changer from the aged care perspective to actually have publication like Pulse IT recognise that aged care is a critical part of the whole care cycle. So thanks for that.
It's always been a particular interest of mine. You can see the obvious positive benefits that technology could bring to aged care, but getting it used, getting it rolled out, a lot of it's funding, a lot of it's digital literacy, all of these problems that are, across the healthcare system, but exacerbated in aged care. I think they're so very obvious. Virtual care, in particular in aged care, is an area that is fascinating and where things can change.
Looking forward to that discussion. Again, 15 years ago, I think Anne Livingston and I were working on some of these particular projects. So Anne and I recently had a discussion that we hope it all works by the time we need it.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, Kate, stay safe. Avoid walking under eucalyptus trees because they're dangerous.
Will do.
And don't climb Mount Wellington.
I won't climb Mount Wellington. Don't worry about that.
Good. We'll see you next time in the studio.
Cheers.
So, George, another jam-packed episode. How do we keep doing this to ourselves? I can't believe I originally thought these episodes would be, 35, 45 minutes. They're usually about an hour. So much going on.
Yeah, and we cut ourselves short. There were so many things to discuss and it's such an exciting time. There's so much happening in the sector, so many opportunities for us to take advantage of, and we haven't really scratched the surface of so many other aspects of it. So looking forward to many, many more of these sessions in the future, Louise.
Yeah, and how great was it to have Chris Longhurst join us in the studio? I mean, that man's intellect, I find it, there's lots of really smart people in our field, but yeah, I always just listen to Chris and go, yeah, wow, he's really smart.
Smart guy, good communicator, great combination. And that's, again, one of the challenges we face in Australia is that we need to grow the communication skills of what we're doing in this sector because there's great stuff happening, but unfortunately, if no one knows about it, we just keep on doing it over and over again.
Yeah, and especially because we've got some excellent academics who, again, going to be joining us in future episodes, but actually having people focusing, as Chris does, in the day-to-day algorithms and that AI health paradox that he spoke about as well, where we really need to be researching what we do and doing what we research as well.
Excellent. Looking forward to further discussions.
Absolutely. And actually, I'll put in the show notes, Kate wrote a brilliant piece about Chris Longhurst and what he had to say about AI and the work that he's doing at the centre. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So, George, can you read us out?
Always a pleasure working with you, Louise, and thank you for listening to Pulse, brought to you by Pulse IT News. Pulse is produced by Ivan Jurek of Octopod Productions. Thanks to Nigel Chartres, Emily Mara, and Kate McDonald for contributing to today's episode. Subscribe, follow, and rate Pulse wherever you get your podcasts. You can subscribe to Pulse IT magazine at www.pulseit.news. Send your feedback and questions to pulsepod@pulseit.news, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode.